I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us in Washington, D.C. Thank all the stakeholders that are joining in this event virtually and physically. Today, I'll speak briefly within 15 minutes on a report on supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa, which is the African Economic Outlook Report 2022. The report is structured in 3 chapters. The first one looking at Africa's economic performance and outlook in the short to medium term. Chapter 2 looks at climate resilience and the just energy transitions in Africa. What are the issues we need to look into here? And then Chapter 3 looks at financing that climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. And we draw some conclusions for policymakers at different levels. Let me just delve into Chapter 1. First, we see that the COVID-19 caused a contraction in Africa's GDP growth by about 1.9% in 2020. But the continent has been very resilient. We saw a rebound to 6.9% in 2021. But because of the overlapping crisis of geopolitical tensions, climate change impacts, and imported inflation, and several other factors, we are projecting a decline to 4.1% in 2022 and 2023. Now, there are several factors that drive this growth and these projections, but we also see a differentiation according to the different regions of the continent. Let me just talk briefly about Eastern Africa, which I'm trying to look into deeply because that was the only region on the continent that did not see a contraction in their GDP growth in 2020 because of COVID-19. Again, the structure of the economy, the policies that has been implemented, and so on. But the beautiful thing here is that if you look at Southern Africa that had the highest depression because of COVID-19, up to 6%, we have seen positive rebound all across Africa. So the economies of the continent has, as always, been very resilient. If you look at the structures of the economy and what drives these changes, we find that countries that were overly dependent on tourism had the highest hit, up to 12% and more, but other countries that are more resource-rich countries also had depressions. But we see that all these countries have come back to positive growth. But if you look at the macroeconomic fundamentals, we still have 2 major crises that we need to keep watching and working on. One is the debt, rising debt vulnerabilities on the continent. And I have to make the point that debt vulnerabilities was not created by COVID-19 or the Russia-Ukraine war. It's also governance issues, public finance management issues, and several structural reforms that African governments need to address. But also the structure of the global economy in terms of financial flows into the continent that also needs to, we need also to pay attention to. Another crisis that we're looking at here is the issue about the inflationary pressures on the continent, but this is also not restricted just to the continent. But when we try to look at the specific impacts in terms of the financing economic recovery from COVID-19 and overlapping crisis we estimate that Africa needs over $432 billion between 2020 and 2022 to recover from COVID-19 impacts. And it will take the continent, even with that resources made available, if it's made available, over a decade to get back to the pre-COVID poverty reduction rates. So this is really huge because we're seeing almost 30 million Africans being pushed into extreme poverty annually since COVID-19. And the confounding crisis that we're seeing is not making it easier. And in addition, we're having these climate challenges. And that is why this report, Chapter 2, focused on climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa. Key findings here, if you look at climate vulnerability, Africa is the second most vulnerable continent to climate change. But when we looked at climate readiness and climate resilience, Africa is suffering most than all other regions of the continent. Again, the structures of the economy, access to technology, access to knowledge, governance issues, there are several factors that are creating these challenges. So I've already talked about the climate readiness and climate vulnerability, where Africa is the highest. But if you look at the continent in terms of delving deep into the different countries of the region, you find that there are also differentiations in terms of these levels of vulnerability and readiness. We also looked at the impact, the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. What does it really mean for economic growth? And we find that in Africa, we have been losing 5 to 15% of GDP per capita growth because of climate change. And that's in addition to other social fragility forcing impacts. You have mortalities, you have migration, and several issues that climate change is driving on the continent. But one of the things that came out of that analysis is that addressing climate change is not at odds with growing the economies. So we can actually find smart policies that will be allowing us to do this together. One major area that is of interest is in the energy sector. In Africa, unlike most other parts of the region, the major drivers of CO2 emissions is agriculture, land use, and forestry. For several reasons, poverty is driving deforestation to cook food and so on. In the transport sector, we're using very old vehicles. So the per capita, the marginal output in terms of economic welfare gains from using these resources is low because of lack of technical efficiency, and so is the externalities on the environment and so on. So to decouple from this high impact of economic growth in Africa, we need to find technologies and resources to drive economic efficiency in the productive sectors of the continent. So we looked at the transitions that has happened in the energy sector from 1850 to present, and we'll find that in many regions of the world, transitions takes time. So it's not a stop and change technologies, as somehow we're beginning to see some discussions in several quarters with regard to the use of gas and so on. But again, the role of natural gas has been fundamental. Every region of the world that has managed to be able to transition have used gas, natural gas, as a transition fuel. And we see that playing major roles in the United States, in Europe, and in Africa. But in some of the other regions, the role of gas has not really come on very well. But a key thing to point out here is that Africa's energy mix is the least carbon intensive also of the world. So Africa is not really the place to look when we want to try to decouple with regard to current emissions. But because of population growth and the need for growth, we also need to find technologies that will allow Africa not to follow the path that will create higher emissions as we try to address these pressing economic needs. And that led us to an analysis of the carbon credit and carbon debt of the world. When you look at that, you find that Africa's carbon credit, with regards to the low emissions that it has had and the headroom it has per capita to be able to grow its economy while still remaining within the carbon budget of the world, is still very high. Africa's per capita consumption of CO2 emissions, of CO2 in terms of CO2 footprint, is still 0.95% per capita. But then the allowable threshold to optimize for the whole world is 2 CO2 equivalent, 2 tons of CO2 equivalent. But in some other countries, like in the United States, per capita footprint is already about 14. So you see the differentiations and the opportunities that there still remain for Africa in terms of a headroom to continue to grow economies. When we try to quantify what this means in financial terms with regard to using the social cost of carbon, we find that Africa has a carbon credit of up to $4.8 trillion US between now and 2050. But again, when you look at the African continent, as always, we have huge potentials in all sectors of the green transition, whether it be in the raw materials, in the components for green industrialization, in the products that we need, and also in services. We have huge options to be able to transit, to lead the world, actually, in this particular transition. So we've just talked about Congo and the battery minerals in that country, huge opportunities. But we need technologies, we need knowledge, and we need financing to match these potentials so that it can translate to economic welfare gains for the whole world and create sustainability. that led us to looking into financing of this particular transition. Some of the things that we found out that was a bit befuddling to me is that climate finance architecture is currently structured against modeling the global financing architecture. It is therefore very complicated, very loosely defined, so many financing options can easily be classed as climate finance. And that includes ODA, which was supposed to drive poverty reduction. And that also then creates trade-offs between different policy goals. We need to keep in mind that we don't need to only address climate change, we also have poverty, we have all the 17 SDG goals to address. So we need to manage the trade-offs within all these goals as well. And then climate flows, in terms of climate finance flows, is not going to countries that have higher vulnerabilities to climate change. So for me, that's also a form of misallocation of resources that we need to look into. And then that brought us to looking at what does it take for Africa to meet its own share of addressing the COP21 agreement, which we're all celebrating. And we find that Africa, to address its NDCs, nationally determined contributions, it will take about 1.6 trillion US dollars between now and 2030. So, but Africa is still just receiving about 18.3 billion US dollars annually. So that leaves an annual financing gap of over 108 billion US dollars for Africa alone. Keep in mind that the Global Convention is talking about 100 billion for the whole of the developing world, and we have not yet met that. If you look at the clear definition of climate finance, the figures are even smaller. So based on these few findings, we have a few policy recommendations. One, policy coordination. As already mentioned by earlier speakers, we need to begin to think about development as a whole, not in silos. While we're thinking about optimizing on climate, we need to ensure that that addresses poverty and all the other aspects of the SDGs. We need to build and strengthen regional value chains in Africa and in all the other regions to reduce the carbon footprints of products, because even solar panels in Africa have high carbon footprint and high costs because of where they are produced and shipped to Africa, and so on and so forth. We need to scale investments in renewable energy and other distributed energy systems. We have huge opportunities. For me, this is a clear competitive advantage in the global market for the African countries. We need to scale investment in that area. It's win-win-win for everyone if we invest in those. And then we also need to invest in institutional capacity to be able to address the leakages that we see on the continent in several areas, the capacity to even prepare projects and access these climate finance options and so on. But for the developed world, the basic for me will be honoring that $100 billion commitment for the developing countries when we go to COP27. It will help to restore confidence that we are serious about climate change, but it's not enough as well, because even if you release that $100 billion, the vulnerable countries are not going to receive them because of this structure and the misalignment in climate finance. And that is why I'm also calling for a specialized pot of resources from that $100 billion earmarked for the less developed, for the most vulnerable countries in Africa and in the developing countries. We also need to expand and deepen several innovative financing options, the blue bond, the carbon market, sustainability-linked bonds, loans, and so on. There are several innovations that are already there in the market, but are just at their neophyte stages. We need to really scale that. Increased concessional financing for Africa and the developing world is very significant, because the more they're accessing the Eurobond markets, it creates another conundrum with regard to that debt sustainability challenges that I've already talked about. Final conclusions for me. Climate change is a global challenge, a commons challenge. So it doesn't really matter how much one part of the world invests in trying to contain climate change or mitigate CO2 emissions. Once there is climate emissions anywhere in the world, the whole world has climate emissions, because greenhouse gas emissions does not know boundaries. It doesn't need visas. So it will go into the atmosphere and cause impacts anywhere it wishes. So it's in our common interest to be able to address it together. Energy systems transitions is very important, but we need not discuss it in a way that it stops growth in parts of the world, because poverty, as we have already heard, actually engenders environmental degradation. A lot of pollution from Africa is poverty-driven. Deforestation, using old vehicles that, per mileage of travel, you emit huge emissions, and so on and so forth. So we need to make sure that the technologies are adequate for energy transitions, that are adequate, that are cost optimal, and they are also viable for economic growth and sustainable development. Finally, we need decentralized renewable energy, as we talked about, and let's keep in mind the huge amounts that Africa needs to implement NDCs, 1.6 trillion US dollars. The agreement in COP21 was on the condition that 80% of these resources will come from global public finance. And at the moment, what is coming is like 1/10 of what is required. And if Africa does not achieve its NDCs, the world will not achieve the global climate action. Closing words for me. I know people will think this is difficult, huge amounts of resources, we have fiscal challenges everywhere, and I just want to quote Einstein: in the middle of these difficulties lie opportunities for innovation. Let's think together, think big, act big, and save the planet. We cannot use an old map to explore a new world. That's again coming from Einstein. So we really need to rethink what we are doing, who we are, how we approach development. The current development paradigm, the financing architecture we have, structured in the 1940s in the post-war era, has served us so well, but it's time to rethink it and see how we can flow resources to where it's needed. And finally, I quote Els Oyen, a Norwegian scholar, that in any form of trying to solve a social problem, we have to accept that there must be redistribution of resources. Social capital, political capital, financial capital, we need to ensure that that redistribution happens in a way that leads to sustainable outcomes for all of us. Thank you very much.